Monaco Grand Prix is usually the shortest race on the Formula 1 calendar. At least it is for us, the viewers, because you turn it on, you watch the preamble, the 5 lights go out, and after the first lap, you just simply turn it off. Nothing to see here. The race will pretty much finish just as it started. The winner will win from pole, and so on and so on and so on, and, well, you're not going to miss much. Might as well flick it on over to Homes Under the Hammer on the other side. And it's something that's caused the track to attract criticism in recent years. Have the cars outgrown the track? Is it suitable for modern racing? Is it safe enough? Would it still be on the schedule if it wasn't an almost 100-year-old race? The list continues. And that's not to say every Monaco Grand Prix is a surefire way of sending insomniacs into the sleep they so desire. There have been a couple of outliers in recent memory. 2016, when Daniel Ricciardo looked set to win only for Red Bull to not have his tyres to hand, and then win 2 years later in a car that was slowly falling apart mechanically. Then there's 2008, where a gamble on tyres allowed Lewis Hamilton to win the race after he clipped a wall and got a puncture early doors. And there's also 1996, where Olivier Panis had his car filled to the brim with fuel and just went for it, only just making the end as every other car with the exception of just 3 crashed out or blew up. And I say that last one is recent memory, it was 28 years ago. But then 1984 was 20 years ago. In my mind. But we need to go back 32 years to the Monaco Grand Prix that we're going to look at today. A race where Ayrton Senna managed to put a dent in Williams' most dominant season ever. And there's an appearance from a certain somebody in this video too. It's hard to think then that the glitz and glamour of Monaco didn't really exist at one point. It was supposedly once a hive of scum and villainy to the point where Queen Victoria would repeatedly decline to visit when she was in the area, and it was nearby Nice that was the place where it was all happening. With the construction of the casinos and now being a home for the rich and famous that don't want to file a tax return, the Monaco Grand Prix has now become the identity of the small principality located in between France and Italy on the Mediterranean coast. It wasn't until after the Second World War that Monaco really upped its reputation. It had spent the second half of the war being occupied by Italy and Germany. And in the years since 1950 and the formation of the World Championship and when this story starts, one man owned the streets of Monaco. Graham Hill had the most wins on the streets of Monte Carlo with 5 at the time that this story takes place. Considering Monaco's place as a jewel in the crown of European racing, even though it might not be considered as much now, 5 wins was a lot, considering not many people had won it more than once. Prost had 4, Senna at the time had 4, Moss had 3 and Stewart had 3, but winning 2 or more was considered a big deal. But Ayrton Senna was without doubt the new king of Monaco. There's that onboard from 1989 I think it is where he's driving one-handed and the car is being driven on the ragged edge. Such was his driving style, and some regard his 1988 pole lap as being the best lap in Formula 1 history. I'm actually struggling to think of one that's as good if not better. There's Hamilton's Singapore lap from 2019, I think it was, where he pulled it out of his arse right at the last second. There's Schumacher matching Villeneuve to the 1,000th of a second at Jerez in 1997, and some might say Verstappen at Jeddah in 2021, although I don't see how that could be the best lap in history when he hit a wall. So unless someone like Jochen Rindt or Jackie Stewart pulled 5.5 seconds out their arse at the Nürburgring back in the day, then yes, Senna in 88 is the best qualifying lap in Formula 1 history. But going into the 1992 Monaco Grand Prix, there was both one of the best cars and also one of the worst cars, but not the same car because that would be weird. Nigel Mansell had been given a god-tier car, the Williams FW14B, a car that's had its own dedicated video in the past. It was a car that had active suspension, traction control, anti-lock brakes and all sorts of other gizmos that allowed the car to pull up into corners without locking up, be able to mash the throttle with minimal wheel slip, and the active suspension meant that the ride height could be played with to get things to handle just right at any point during the race, as the ride height could be lowered as the fuel burnt off, and it meant that the car had the best handling all the time. As such, Mansell had won the opening 5 rounds of the season from pole position, and it would have been a Williams 1-2 for the opening 5 rounds as well if Patrese had not retired in Spain. After that, it was a fight for best of the rest, which at the time was a young Michael Schumacher in the Benetton who was picking up the scraps behind, while Senna's season had started a bit slower as his races in Mexico, Brazil and Spain hadn't really gone to plan as he was chasing a 4th world title. But the Michael and Ayrton had a lot of work to do because that Williams was seemingly unstoppable. Meanwhile, at the other end of the grid was the Andrea Moda team, a team that had joined the grid in 1992 from the ashes of the Coloni team and owned by footwear entrepreneur Andrea Sassetti. The team had been through a tough time in the opening rounds. They were refused entry to the South African Grand Prix because the FIA had said that Andrea Moda had only bought the assets of Coloni and not Coloni's entry, and Sassetti was supposedly trying to dodge paying the $100,000 that was required to join the grid. At least, back then anyway. Then, after the Brazilian Grand Prix, which they also didn't participate at, the two drivers at the time in Alex Caffey and Enrico Battaglia were sacked because they basically said, "Dude, where's my car?" So instead, Andrea Moda hired journeyman driver and man who would drive a wheelie bin if he was offered the opportunity to do so, Roberto Moreno. They also hired young Englishman Perry McCarthy, who would later go on to have a career dressing in black and ragging cars around an old airfield. The problem was, not long after both drivers were hired, Battaglia had gone back to Andrea Moda with about $1 million worth of sponsorship, but the FIA said, "You've used 4 drivers already, you're not using any more," and as such, Sassetti wasn't going to get his money. So, out of bitterness, spite, whatever you want to call it, all resources were diverted to Moreno's car, while McCarthy's car was left in... well, basically, if he crashed it and was hurt, there would be lawsuits. McCarthy wrote about his Monaco experiences in his book Flat Out, Flat Broke. The team still hadn't made a proper seat for me, so I had taken a beating inside the cockpit, but I kept my foot down and was desperately trying to remember where the next corner was. I knew the tunnel was taken flat out on my first lap, but as I came back into daylight at 170 miles an hour, I was being bounced around so badly I had double vision, and I vividly remember speeding towards the tyre barrier, wondering if I should turn left or right. Anyway, I was called back to the pits, and that was my run for the day. McCarthy was having an utterly horrible time out there, and the online stats don't make for much better reading. In fact, they only add insult to injury by showing that he clocked a time of over 30 minutes in pre-qualifying. Moreno, though, was having a slightly better time of things. The car was actually getting better on a race-by-race basis, and at Imola it had actually shown that the car wasn't so bad after all. The Judd engine was just a bit naff, really, but it also meant that Andrea Moda would have its day of days when Moreno was in the top 3 in pre-qualifying and made it into the 30 that would be whittled down to 26 over the 2 qualifying sessions. I thought I'd include that little sub-story as well as the whole Mansell versus everybody else thing because A, Roberto Moreno is like the channel mascot or whatever you want to call him, and I need the views, so if I mention him, people are going to watch, and it shows the duality of that season. You've got Williams up here, a highly organised team that has built an absolute god-tier car that's got all the gizmos you could possibly want on it and have basically something that was borderline unbeatable in the right hands, and then down here, you've got Andrea Moda, who couldn't organise a piss-up in a brewery. Back up at the front, Mansell was almost a full second clear of his teammate Patrese, with Senna over a second behind. Alesi, meanwhile, was 4th in an absolute pig of a Ferrari, but the thought for the weekend was, alright, Mansell's won, we can't compete with that. And also on the entry list was the son of Mr. Monaco himself, Damon Hill, who was driving for Brabham, but he qualified 28th and therefore didn't make the starting grid. But guess who did make the grid? Moreno! The guy just scraped through into 26th and last place ahead of Eric van der Perle in the sister Brabham to Hill, and Bobby M was just .036 from the cutoff. Doesn't matter, still made it to the grid. Andrea Moda had achieved the impossible considering their position in the pecking order and the fact that McCarthy in the other car was down as being 20 minutes off the fastest pre-qualifying time. But McCarthy did go on to have the best job in the world, so swings and roundabouts. And actually, I think Damon might be the first son of a driver to make the grid, not just the first son of a world champion to make the grid. There is a Fittipaldi on the grid, you might have seen it just there, but he's the nephew of Emerson rather than the son. I've just looked it up, and no, he isn't, because Wilson Fittipaldi, who is Christian's father, drove for Brabham in the 70s. And yes, there's Copa Sucar there as well, but we'll look at all that at a future date. The race began, and Senna managed to leapfrog Patrese, who had been far too careful into Sainte-Devote. Patrese had backed right out to avoid hitting Mansell, and Senna went for the gap that existed. A quote I absolutely hate because it's now become an excuse for bad driving. I mean, it was an excuse for bad driving in the first place because it translated to, yeah, I punted him off, what you gonna do, but I digress. The order at the end of the first lap was Mansell, Senna, Patrese, Alesi, Schumacher and Berger. Schumacher, like Senna, had made a move at the first corner. Moreno, meanwhile, was up to 19th as cars dropped off around him. The little trooper. But on lap 11, the V10 Judd in the back of the Andrea Moda gave up, and that was Bobby M out of the race. Sag. A few laps later, Schumacher tried to lob it up the inside of Alesi into the Lowe's hairpin, but ended up smacking into the side of the Ferrari, causing damage to the electronics in Alesi's car. An incident similar to the 1997 collision with Villeneuve in terms of damage sustained to the other vehicle. Alesi was able to continue for another few laps before the problem became terminal, while Schumacher continued. But Mansell had buggered off into the lead. In no time at all, his lead was 22 seconds, and Senna's chances of winning his 5th Monaco Grand Prix in 6 attempts were pretty much zero at this point. There was no way the McLaren could compete with the Williams, even in Senna's hands, but Senna later admitted to Motorsport magazine at the time that he was planning to take advantage late race if need be. Mansell was essentially in cruise mode. He wasn't going anywhere near as hard or as fast as he had been in previous races, where he was basically setting the fastest lap every single lap. But I guess this is Monaco. If he had a brain fart, he's going into a wall rather than going a little bit wide onto some grass or whatever. So if he cruised a bit, just nursed it home, he'd get his first win at Monaco, something that had eluded him for so long. Senna would have had some intervention if this was the modern era. Ivan Capelli, who had been running 5th at one point, ended up having a bizarre accident on lap 61, when he spun at Casino Square and ended up damaging his steering. When he went through the swimming pool section up to Rascasse, he looped the car and ended up hitting the tyre wall, and then ended up being perched on top of it at a 45-degree angle, which led Murray Walker and James Hunt to bring up the speculation regarding his future. This won't of course have done his Ferrari position any good, because although Luca de Montezemolo, the Ferrari boss of both the passenger and the racing car divisions, has said that Capelli's position is safe, some of us doubted that statement, and Capelli has gone off and out of the race, out of 5th position and out of a possible 2 points for the team. Some of us are horrible cynics, yes. Had there been a safety car, as there probably would be today, and actually thinking about it, the safety car thing is something I do need to talk about, like the history of the safety car, and also it's ironic that the safety car would have been called because of something involving Senna just 2 years later, which is weird to think about. Senna could have closed up to Mansell at the restart and maybe attacked into Sandoval and then held him up. But instead, he got some, well, a different kind of intervention. Divine intervention, you might want to call it. On lap 70, Mansell had what he thought was a puncture, but it turned out to be a loose wheel nut. In pitting, Mansell lost the lead. His careful driving had pushed the gap up to about 30 seconds, but had only been extended by about 2 seconds in the last 10 laps or so, and he lost 15 just by driving back round to the pits. But with fresh tyres, he set off in hot pursuit of Senna, setting the fastest lap on the first full lap that was 2 seconds faster than what Senna had done as his fastest lap all race. Senna, meanwhile, had been on the same set of tyres he'd started the race on, because in those days, tyre changes just weren't really a thing. The gap went from 5.2 seconds to 1.9 in just 2 laps. But because it's Monaco, there was nowhere to get by. Senna was blocking like a madman, and it was a lot like 2019 when Hamilton and Verstappen were doing pretty much the exact same thing. And also something to note, the cars were wider then than they are now. Okay, only 20 mil wider, but still. Senna's blocking harmed Mansell further because Mansell was picking up marbles and discarded rubber by going constantly offline, and this harmed the grip, even in that Williams. At any other circuit, Mansell would have just sailed on by, but because you've got one car in vain trying to overtake and one car trying desperately to defend, it made for great television viewing, at least. Well, I've since watched the clips back. I didn't get to watch it live, but still, if you turned off after the first lap and a half of the Grand Prix, you probably looked like a fool when you heard later on what had happened. As it was, Senna hung on to take the win by just over 2/10, with Mansell settling for second. Patrese was 30 seconds back and had been suffering with gearbox issues, and then the Michael took 4th. Brundle, in the other Benetton, was 5th and was also the last car on the same lap, while 12 people finished. Lot of gearbox related retirements on the results sheet there, but hey, that's Monaco. Mansell was so physically and mentally drained from trying to pass Senna that he had to be carried up onto the podium to collect his trophy. After the champagne was sprayed, he was seen sitting down on the tarmac of the start-finish straight, and he did drive the entire season with a broken ankle. He then went on to win the IndyCar Championship the following year with a broken back. One thing to also note here is that in 6th place was Bertrand Gachot driving for Venturi, or LaRousse by any other name. The other LaRousse, driven by Ukyo Katayama, didn't even pre-qualify for the race. He was one of the 2 drivers, along with McCarthy, that didn't even make the Saturday qualifying sessions. And I know there will be people that will say, if that was Monaco, Senna wouldn't have won. No way. And yeah, you're probably right, the track helped, but still, Mansell could have had a good run out of the chicane or the final corner and overtaken that way. I mean, that Williams, fresh tyres, it's something that you would try to do. It could still be done, but it still required Senna to be on the ball while driving using his mirrors, and Mansell to be on the ball to back out of an overtake without smashing into the rear of the McLaren and taking them both out. While Senna's car did have a flappy paddle gearbox, Mansell still had all those toys on hand to help him, but Mansell had to really push to get by. Senna was knackered too. As he tried to hold his trophy aloft, he could, well, barely do it, and both drivers showed the utmost respect to each other afterwards in their post-race comments to the media and the press and things like that. I mean, Mansell did admit later on he probably should have given Senna a bit of a love tap on the rear wheel to give him a puncture, but, well, he didn't. They managed to drive for those final 3 laps without making contact. But it's not like Mansell lost much from the 6 points he gained for finishing second. He was still way out in front on 56 points. Patrese second with 29, Schumacher on 20, Senna now up to 18 with the 10 points he got for the win, and Berger still on single figures with 8. In the Constructors, Williams were in a world of their own on 84 points. McLaren was second on 26, having leapfrogged Benetton, who were on 25, and then Ferrari on 9 points, and Footwork, who we looked at not long ago, with 5. Mansell would never win the Monaco Grand Prix. Senna equalled Graham Hill's tally of 5 wins with this victory, and then 12 months later, he'd take the 6th victory, a record that nobody has got close to, well, since. But the 3-lap sprint to the end was just off the chain with those cars and those drivers. Would it happen today? Probably not. The rules have changed in regards to blocking and all of that stuff, but with all the dipping, ducking, diving and dodging, it was the race where Senna tamed the lion. So then, a look at the utterly mental 1992 Monaco Grand Prix. If this has been a look through the history books that you've enjoyed, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on any future stories or opinion pieces from this channel. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help support me at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, the F1 store, and some other bits and pieces that you might want or need to know. And there's also super thanks if you just want to buy me a coffee or a sausage roll, and memberships if you want to do Patreon, but differently. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.